Okay, welcome back. This is part 2 of the week 5 video lecture for the social science capstone class. So I left off in the first part of this video lecture talking about methods of sampling for your participants in your study. So random sampling, of course, is completely unbiased. You're drawing names from a hat. Let's start again with the sampling frame. I wasn't explaining it very well towards the end of the last video, so let's start with that. The sampling frame are those participants who are accessible to a researcher. So you may not have access to all of the participants out there who meet your criteria for your study. You may only have access to some. For example, if you're studying the alumni of a certain school, that's the example the book gives, you may not have the contact information for all of the alumni at this school. As you know, some of them may have graduated years and years and years ago, and they're impossible to track down now. So your sampling frame includes just those alumni whose contact information is still current. So that's just those alumni who are accessible. That's your sampling frame. But remember that this is not the same as just those participants who are available. Accessible and available are two different things. You can have participants who are accessible who may not be available to participate in your study. If you're just limiting your study to those who are available, that's accidental or convenience sampling. That's not your sampling frame. So keep that distinction in mind, accessible versus available. Accessible is a sampling frame, and available is accidental or convenience sampling, which we'll talk some more about later. There's also stratified random sampling. To do that, you divide participants into non-random subgroups, and then you randomly select within each subgroup. So the example the book gives is, let's say you're studying graduates of a high school, and you first divide them up into male or female. And that, of course, is not random, because you're dividing them up into groups based on gender. You're not just drawing names out of a hat for your sample. So you're dividing them into subgroups that are not random at first, but then within each subgroup, you randomly select different female students, and then you randomly select different male students, almost like you're randomly selecting out of two different hats. Who's in what hat is not random, but how you select people from each hat is random. So that's stratified random sampling, and do look at the example in the book on that as well. Another method of sampling, this is the method I've used most often and that you may find useful, especially for qualitative research, and that's snowball sampling. Snowball sampling is not having like this data list or this preset resource to go to begin with to find your participants. You kind of let your participants find you, in that you start out with a few people, maybe even the pilot people for your study, people you won't really include in your research, but just good contacts to help you find participants for your study. So you start out with a few people, and then you let them help you find more participants for your study among their acquaintances, their friends, or their colleagues. So for example, those of you who took methods with me know that in my study of Hindu immigrant widows, I used snowball sampling in that through some of my relatives, I found just a couple of Hindu widows to interview, and then at the end of my interviews with those Hindu widows, I asked them to recommend other Hindu widows they knew to participate in my study as well. So that's snowball sampling. My interviewees are recommending others who can also be interviewees in my study, and that's how I find them. Same thing with my study on Asian Indian doctors. I started out with a few doctors that I found from Indian doctors clubs. Those few doctors told me about other doctors who participated in my study, who then told me about other doctors, and so on and so on. That's snowball sampling. There's also an example of writing about using snowball sampling in topic 29 on page 69 of the book. you'll want to look at that if you plan to use this method of sampling. There's also the convenience or the accidental sample, which I mentioned in the previous slide. And it's participants who are immediately accessible, or in other words, who are available to you. So you are limited by their availability. The example given in the book, which is actually quite common from what Dr. Brown was telling me the other day. I talked to Dr. Brown on our campus the other day about what we're doing in this course, and he talked about how a lot of psychologists base their studies on the students they teach. They get their freshman and sophomore college students in their introductory courses to take a survey or to participate in their study, and that's their sample. And this is a convenience or accidental sample because these are participants who are immediately accessible and available to them, college students in their classroom. So they take advantage of that. The challenge here is to recognize that your diversity in your sample may be limited. Most, as you know, freshmen and sophomores in college, traditional students come from a certain class background or certain educational background or a certain region, maybe even a certain race or gender. So if you're going to do a convenience or accidental sample, you have to account for diversity, either by writing to say you're aware of the lack of diversity in your sample, or to ensure that diversity somehow in using that sample. Again, this is explained further on page 69, topic 29, example 2 in the book. Okay, some other methods of sampling you may want to use. Cluster sampling. That means you're randomly selecting groups, not randomly selecting individuals. So this works well with groups that are already pre-formed. Like, let's say you want to study a particular organization. The book gives the example of Girl Scouts. You can just randomly select Girl Scout troops to study for your research. So when you select your sample out of the hat, what you're selecting out of the hat is the name of the whole troop, not the name of an individual Girl Scout. Another example the book uses is, let's say you're studying some high school students and they're already divided up into homeroom classes. Well, you can randomly select different homeroom classes to use for your study instead of randomly selecting individual students. Again, that's cluster sampling. If you want to see how to write about cluster sampling in your research proposal, look at example 1 on page 71. Also, multi-stage sampling is just what it says. Think about it in terms of nesting or a pyramid format. You're writing first about sampling from a large group, and then after you've sampled from that large group, how are you going to sample again from the smaller group that was part of that large group? And then you may want to sample again from the smaller group to end up with an even smaller group. So in other words, you go from larger to smaller groups, and you're sampling from each group to get a smaller and smaller and smaller sample size. How you sample at each stage is really up to you. There's an example on page 71. You may want to look at that. Of course, the more stages of sampling you have, the more complicated and complex it gets. So you may want to stop at 2 stages, 3 at the most. You may not need to have different stages. You may just need to sample once and that's it. Moving on to section G in Patten, you'll also want to write about, after writing about your participants, you'll want to write about your instrumentation, or basically what measurement tools or what types of measurement are you going to use in your research. If yours is a qualitative study, and a lot of you are doing qualitative studies, you're most likely going to do semi-structured interviews. As you may remember from the social research design class, semi-structured interviews are interviews where you go in with an interview guide. So a lot of your questions are pre-planned, but other questions will just come up during the course of the interview. And so that's why it's semi-structured. Not everything is planned in advance. Some things are spontaneous or improvised during the course of the interview. And that's why we always say to remain flexible when you're doing interviews for qualitative research. Participant observation is another form of qualitative research. You take part in a group while you are observing it. You may choose to do that. You may choose to do participant observation along with semi-structured interviews. That's what I did for my research on Asian Indian doctors. You may want to do non-participant observation, and this is where the people you study become subjects and not participants, because many times they're not aware that you are observing them. So non-participant observation is you observing others without directly taking part in what the others are doing. If you're going to choose non-participant observation, you really need to be specific about what types of behavior you will be looking for in observing others. You'll probably want to write about that as well with participant observation. There are a lot of different things you can observe in a situation, but you need to filter and you need to focus. So how are you going to filter and focus and decide what exactly you want to observe and write about? That's explained more on page 73 in the book. Or not page 73, I'm sorry. That is explained further on pages 77 and 78 in the book, topic 32. You may decide to use published instruments for your research. In fact, this could make your research a lot easier for you, but of course only if a published instrument works for you. A published instrument is someone else's measurement tool, a measurement tool like a scale or a test or a survey that a previous researcher has come up with and published, and you may want to use that same scale or test or survey for your own research and see what different or similar results it yields. So if you're going to do that, you'll want to give a justification for why you're using someone else's measurement tool and why it will work for your study. You may also have to ask permission for using that measurement tool. So if you came across a measurement tool in your research for your literature review that you really liked and you want to test its validity or reliability or how it differs by region or whatnot, you may want to use a published instrument. Or you may find that the published instruments don't work well for the research you want to do, and you want to propose a brand new instrument, a brand new scale or test or survey. If you're going to do that, then you really need to explain why you think proposing something brand new is right for your research. So you'll be answering the questions: why is it necessary? How will this new measurement tool be structured in general, overall? And then what specific items, such as in a survey or test, give a few specific items that it will contain. And how will you make changes and tweak it if necessary during the course of the study? How will you develop and refine it? See the example on page 81 for how to write about a new instrument and answer all these questions. And these are good questions to answer for qualitative work too. Why or how will your interview guide be structured? Why are you asking the questions you are? Give some examples of specific questions. And how will you develop and refine the interview guide in doing more and more interviews? Will you add new questions? Will you take out some? Will you reword them? So all good questions to think about and answer in your methods section. Now we get to the demographics that you have to write about in your methods section. I would think all of you are going to have to collect some demographic information for your study. So you need to say what demographic information you're going to collect and why. Demographic information, of course, is race, class, gender, age, educational level. So tell us what demographic information is important for your study and why. And there's an example of this on page 83. And I'm going to stop here with this video lecture because I'm nearing 15 minutes. And then the last video lecture, part 3, will wrap this up for you. All right, see you in a second.